Originally, this was just going to be a review of Immortals Fenyx Rising, and I was going to do my best to avoid the obvious Breath of the Wild comparison, kinda like when I did my Blasphemous review while trying to avoid comparisons to Dark Souls. Eventually, though, I just kinda said, F it, let's invite the comparison and see where that ends up. After all, Ubisoft certainly did, so let's get started. On the surface, both of these games actually have a lot in common. And by that I mean on the surface, Fenyx Rising bit off a lot of its content from Breath of the Wild, but it did so 3 years later, so instead of feeling fresh and new, it felt stale and uncomfortable the second I turned it on, but we'll get to that in a bit. For now, let's approach this one step at a time by comparing specific points of interest. Firstly, we'll start with the little fact that Fenyx Rising looks like deep-fried bird shit. I'm not usually one to bang on about graphics. I mean, most of my favorite games could be accurately recreated with refrigerator magnets on the side of an excited dog, but Fenyx Rising is honestly hard to look at sometimes. I understand that this was probably made by a small team of benchwarmers, since all of Ubisoft's A-list players were probably busy on Assassin's Creed Valhalla modeling Eivor's every photorealistic butt hair, but holy f*** is this game ugly. I think my issue with it is that it's not really stylized quite enough to pull off the Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic that it's trying to make happen, and instead feels like one of those weird early 2000s CGI cartoons that no one with functioning eyeballs actually liked. It's strangely reminiscent of the early days of 3D gaming when the animators were so blown away by the fact that they could make models move their limbs that once they started doing it, they forgot to stop. Characters wobble and flop all over the place like overcooked asparagus, flailing their arms and heads around with every syllable like one of those inflatable tube guys a bobblehead, and their awful lip syncing and facial animations stand out like a dog turd in a fruit salad.
Winged Herald? No way! You are...
You know what else had stylized modeling and movement reminiscent of a Saturday morning cartoon? Breath of the Wild. But its shading and color palette was subdued enough to allow it to flex its muscles on the animation. Characters moved in exaggerated ways, but it worked because their motions were fluid and had more than 4 frames apiece, so they felt like they had weight and depth rather than jerking around awkwardly like marionettes on strings made of cold spaghetti. Fenyx Rising's draw distance is also a little bit funky, at least in the first area you start off in. Typically, you can't see more than a few feet away before things get obscured in fog, which will be just fine and could add some decent atmosphere, but the skybox is largely the same brown-gray color, so it all kind of fades together and makes the whole opening part of the game feel like an environment test demo rather than a finished product. At first I thought maybe this was just an optimization choice, since the Switch's hardware is about as easily stressed as an over-caffeinated badger, but then I remembered that Breath of the Wild had a pretty decent draw distance, a comparable-sized map, and didn't look like you were swimming through a runoff treatment plant the day after a major holiday, so I had to shelve that theory and instead assume that the environment design was done entirely by interns or possibly the studio's bathroom sink. Admittedly, this becomes kind of a non-issue later when you're exploring the more open areas and you can actually see off into the distance without the fog getting in the way, but I'm still really confused as to why they started off that way. I mean, come on guys, you're supposed to use the first couple hours to hook me in, not make me feel like I could get the same visual experience by watching old episodes of Wallace and Gromit projected on the side of a dead rat. There's also the very small matter of pacing. That is to say, there isn't any. I think the Fenyx Rising voice actors must have recorded their lines in separate rooms on different days and at varying levels of sobriety, and to accommodate cutting the lines together, they left pauses before and after each one, but the trained dolphin they hired as an editor forgot to take them back out again, so characters are randomly stopped dead in the middle of a conversation to awkwardly stare at each other for several seconds like they just noticed a particularly eggy fart and aren't sure which one of them it was before continuing on like nothing happened. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, avoided this issue altogether by having most of the characters only speak in text boxes and by not having Link speak at all, so everyone could just monologue to him uninterrupted. It also helps that Breath of the Wild's writing was actually, written rather than slapped together by a dialogue-generating algorithm that thinks the pinnacle of humor is having one character explain the joke to another character while waggling their eyebrows. Yeah, it wasn't exactly War and Peace, but at least I was invested in it. I cared about the characters, and probably would have cared about them a bit more if most of them hadn't been dead for 100 years already by the time the game started, which admittedly sucked a decent amount of suspense out of their story arcs, and I certainly didn't play Breath of the Wild for Link's story. In general, when it comes to Chosen One narratives, I tend to not really care about anyone but the side characters, because how can you possibly have any concern for someone who's been destined by the almighty hand of God to always win in the end? Breath of the Wild managed to avoid this particular pitfall, though, by making the plot take place after Link had already catastrophically failed at the whole saving the kingdom thing, and instead having to save whatever piles of rubble and random sticks happen to still be inhabited, so you at least have the sense that failure is an option in one way or another. Fenyx Rising, by comparison, can't seem to decide if it's set in a story being told as it's happening, a story being made up on the fly, or a story that's already happened and is just being related up to a point. On the one hand, a major conceit of the plot is that Phoenix's story is being relayed by Prometheus to Zeus, presumably as it happens, but at one point Zeus interrupts to add some random bullshit and it actually affects what's happening to you in-game, so are they just making this up and the whole giant monster threatening the universe thing is just a weirdly elaborate LARP, or do Zeus and Prometheus have the power to just casually warp reality? In which case, one wonders why they even need Fenyx when they can just will things in and out of existence like a twitchy painter with a nuclear detonator. The writing smacks of making it up as you go, which may or may not be highly appropriate now that I think about it. For example, there's a point shortly after you get the magical gauntlets of strength where someone steals them from you, but then he just gives them right back 5 minutes later for no readily apparent reason. I sat there wondering what exactly the point of that was, but then I realized that the place you have to go to trigger a cutscene where he gives them back at the end, a place about 5 feet away, by the way, has a locked door that you need the magic bracers to open. And other than him returning the bracers at the end of the cutscene leading into it, it has nothing to do with that. So the only reason they had the bracers get stolen was to keep you from opening that door too early. But you still have to walk through the room that door is in order to trigger the whole getting them back thing in the first place. So why not just trigger the cutscene right as you enter the building and cut out those meaningless 10 minutes that don't affect the plot in any way whatsoever? Speaking of writing, do you remember that part in Breath of the Wild where Link sees a couple of monsters and goes, "Oh no, it's too bad I have no hope of fighting these monsters since I am just a hopeless underdog and it sure would be scary for me to face them since I might not make it out alive," and then he immediately backflipped over one of them, landed on the other, and then knocked the first one out with a spinning hook to the jaw? No? Yeah, that's because it didn't happen. But that is essentially what happens in Fenyx Rising, because the writers at Ubisoft think that being subtle is only shoving one lit firecracker up your nose before walking into a room filled with sleeping ferrets. See, Breath of the Wild manages to make you feel like you were facing impossible odds by having you wake up half naked in the middle of nowhere and forcing you to defend yourself with nothing but a stick you found and a can-do attitude. Fenyx, on the other hand, spends the first hour of the game crying about how outclassed they are while magical weapons are just being handed to them with little to no effort. What this adds up to is an absurd amount of ludonarrative dissonance that you just can't rationalize your way around. To both of you who understood that sentence, congratulations, you probably don't get invited to many parties, and to the rest of you, let me explain. See, generally gameplay and narrative are meant to complement and inform each other rather than flounder around in their own separate rooms like newlyweds in their first big fight. For example, in Breath of the Wild, you start off extremely weak and have to become the warrior you're meant to be by learning new skills, increasing your health pool, and generally becoming more adept at the game's mechanics to allow you to take on bigger and stronger monsters. This means that your experience as a player mirrors Link's experience as a character, since the story revolves around him waking up in a weakened state and having to train to become powerful enough to fight the final boss. In Fenyx Rising, Fenyx wakes up unarmed and presumably weak, and both the narrators and Fenyx themselves won't stop telling you about how they've never held a sword before and wouldn't know the first thing about killing monsters right before picking up a sword and killing a whole group of monsters at once without breaking a sweat. That wouldn't be so bad if that was the point at which it clicked for Fenyx that maybe they can handle themselves, but instead they keep complaining, and it just feels like the gameplay designers and story writers were locked in shipping containers sunk into very distant oceans for the duration of the game's development. As far as the cast of characters is concerned, it's a little bit difficult to compare them, to be honest. Let's face it, Link is barely a character. He's more like some kind of weird mute cryptid that appears every 100 years to break all your pottery and cut your grass before running back into the forest. That said, he did have a little bit of room to grow in Breath of the Wild. He feels kind of world-weary and tired and haunted by his failure in the past. He even has a few emotional moments where he shows how scared he is to fail in his fight with Ganon, again, without actually speaking a word of dialogue. By contrast, Fenyx manages to be 7 or 8 different characters while never shutting the fuck up. I swear they had a different writer for them for every cutscene. There's a point a little ways in where they've already visited Tartarus, been gifted Hercules' magical bracers, found a sword, axe, and bow that all grant special magic gifts, received special coins from portals leading to the literal afterlife, wielded Zeus's lightning bolts and Icarus's wings, and fought multiple legendary monsters like Cyclopses, Gorgons, and Harpies, and they still stand in stunned silence when they learn that all of those things are real. I had assumed up until this point that they lived in a world where that was just generally accepted, since they go through most of these things without much reaction, other than the first Gorgon sighting, but apparently Fenyx is just constantly high as giraffe nuts and thought they hallucinated everything. Now, I'm not going to act like Breath of the Wild broke a million new barriers and brought peace to the universe, but what it did very well. It had an organic method of expanding its focus as you explored the world without ever stepping on its own toes or making you feel like you missed something if you did any of the side quests out of order. Its combat system, puzzles, and environment was simple, but had so many little quirks and tricks that I don't recall ever getting bored with it before running out of things to do in general. It only took me about 2.5 hours to get tired of Fenyx Rising, and here's why. I had already played it. It seems that Ubisoft realized that if they could just lure Breath of the Wild into a dark alley, they could steal its skin and drape it over Assassin's Creed Odyssey like a sticky, damp bedsheet. And no, seriously, look at this. It's the same exact game. It's just been reskinned and dumbed down a bit. Functionally identical menu systems and GUIs, same equipment loadouts, almost the exact same combat controls. Weapons and armor designs are basically the same, if not entirely identical, and I'm fairly sure that a few of the voice actors have been recycled as well. Even the combat animations are just copy-pasted directly over like a design document at Activision. Despite this, they still tutorialize everything endlessly. I mean, yeah, Breath of the Wild took the time to pause the game and give you a little update on every single piece of horse manure you happen to step in, but at least they did so more or less silently. There's a moment in Fenyx Rising when you unlock the home base type area where you can upgrade your skills, and every single thing you can do has an entire tutorial cutscene dedicated to it, and the explanations are so gratingly long-winded and filled with failed attempts at humor that by the third one I just about chewed through my own tongue so that I never run the risk of being as endlessly irritating as these two characters. And then, even after you learn how to use everything, you still have to sit through an unskippable cutscene every time you do anything here. If they've patched in a skip button by the time this comes out, kindly ignore this bit, thank you. Apparently, the day-night cycle doesn't stop during cutscenes either, so it was pretty telling when one went on so long that about halfway through it suddenly got real dark like a fat salamander had wandered across the stage lights, and then when the cutscene was over, the game suddenly snapped awake and made it daytime again as if it was hoping I wouldn't notice. Then again, there is one thing Fenyx Rising has that Breath of the Wild doesn't. Microtransactions. And not only does it have them, but Fenyx actually complains about the prices, at which point the character running the shop admits that he's the god of thieves. Ubisoft, allow me to put this in words you'll understand. Joke about do bad thing while still do bad thing, not make bad thing good thing, you absolute pile. I think the biggest overlap between Breath of the Wild and Fenyx Rising is probably in the exploration. They both have large open maps with lots of little spaces to explore and poke around in, but while Breath of the Wild took place in mostly expansive fields and mountains with lots of interesting locations to break up the pace, Fenyx Rising seems to take place in a series of floating islands strung together by the absent-minded drool collected from all the playtesters lulled into a fugue state by the gameplay. Both games require you to climb specific vantage points and manually mark points of interest on your map, but Ubisoft is so used to just splashing copy-pasted side quests and objectives all over the place that they forgot to tone it down for this mechanic. The end result is that instead of only marking key points of interest and leaving other discoveries purely to be found by exploring, you have to spend 10 minutes carefully sweeping back and forth like a Roomba with OCD every time you make it to a vantage point, trying to find the one specific pixel that makes the controller vibrate like an angry chihuahua in a tumble dryer, and a lot of the markers are stacked one on top of the other because of course they are, so once you mark the one thing, you gotta carefully nudge the targeting reticle so you can hit the 43rd marker occupying the same half-inch of space like you're playing darts on a teacup ride. You can't walk 3 feet in Fenyx Rising without tripping over a treasure chest or combat encounter, but none of them give nearly enough materials to make it feel like you're accomplishing anything by finding them, and it just ends up feeling like there's too much stuff in too small a space without enough of the stuff you actually want, like a mouthful of whipped cream and hot gravel. In Breath of the Wild, you could trudge along for quite some time before coming across anything even marginally noteworthy, but for some reason I didn't mind all that much because the places that were interesting to discover were pretty tightly designed and fun to look at if nothing else. The closest Fenyx Rising got to that for me was the first few times I stumbled across a puzzle vault or a locked door, because they seem to have at least some effort put into the designs, and I did really enjoy them at first, but eventually I realized they just reused the same 5 or 6 puzzle designs without a lot of variation, and a huge chunk of them have the exact same move ball through maze with air currents puzzles from Breath of the Wild, so it became less about figuring out the solutions to individual puzzles and more about figuring out which kind of puzzle it is, at which point you've probably already figured it out 4 or 5 times in the last half hour alone. Unless it's one of the areas involving finding 4 hidden switches to open a locked door, in which case it's more about how much patience you have for walking around in circles, obsessively checking every nook and cranny like the quality control manager at the English Muffin Factory, and honestly after about my 5th lap, I just couldn't be bothered anymore. Now, far be it from me to complain about grinding in a video game. I'm actually someone who likes a bit of grind, because my average day-to-day life is about as peaceful and relaxing as being a clairvoyant piloting the Hindenburg, so it's nice to be able to throw on a podcast and zone out while I punch monsters and tootle around the map until I'm ready to absorb more of the story missions. But see, there's good grind, like putting 50 Kit Kats in in a blender so you can fit them all in your mouth at once, and there's bad grind, like doing your own nipple piercings with a belt sander. Good grind keeps you invested by keeping things varied enough that it doesn't feel as much like you're just doing the same thing over and over again, or at least makes progression fast enough that you don't lose interest before you're strong enough to continue the main quest. Bad grind makes no attempt to hide the fact that you're just doing the same thing over and over again, or throttles your progress to a crawl in the hopes that you'll get so bored you'll pay real actual money just to make it stop. I'll give you one guess which type of bad grind Fenyx Rising has. Haha, trick question. It's both. The thing is, I didn't even like Breath of the Wild all that much. I enjoyed it while I was playing it, but once I beat it, I put it down and literally never touched it again until it was time to write this review. But at least I finished it. I was invested enough to finish it. Not counting the Kurok Seed collection, because honestly, if I wanted to feel like I was burning away hundreds of hours of my rapidly fleeting and irreplaceable lifespan on something no one will ever see or appreciate with no sense of accomplishment attached, I could just go to my real job and at least get paid. Fenyx Rising just didn't grab me like that. After a certain point, I just stopped. I did. I shut my Switch off and I stopped, and I started playing the Backbone demo again to cleanse my palate, because a tight and intriguing narrative is still more fun to experience for a fourth time than this messy pile of poorly copied mechanics and assets was to experience the first time. Now, I don't want you to leave thinking I hate Fenyx Rising. I want you to know that I hate it. I hate it as much as I hate the amorphous blob of mold and old tonsil stones that currently occupy all the Ubisoft executive positions. I don't hate the people who directly made it, though. I know video games are tough to make, and the indie scene is remarkably hard to get anywhere in unless you're really lucky or Edmund McMillan, and I'm sure a lot of the Fenyx Rising team are genuinely passionate about what they do and jumped at the chance to be able to make a game and get it in front of so many people. The thing is, in pretty much any industry, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who wouldn't make a deal with the devil to make their living doing what they love, but I wish the people behind this game had actually done that instead of committing the arguably worst decision of making a deal with Ubisoft. I'm disappointed more than anything else, if I'm honest. Ubisoft has produced a lot of my favorite games over the years, games that I would have no problem going on and on about how good they are to whoever would listen, like the most friendless man at a wine tasting, but lately it's starting to feel like they just don't care anymore. They know we're gonna suck down whatever garbage they puke up like a bunch of beeping baby sparrows, and as a result they don't need to do anything but frog march the same exact couple of games out every year in slightly different pairs of pants like a fashion show in North Korea, and as someone who's unashamedly played and mostly liked every Assassin's Creed game that wasn't Liberation or whatever the hell Chronicles was, I can't help but feel like it's partially my fault. Maybe I failed you, Ubisoft. Maybe I encouraged you for too long while you burrowed into your comfort zone like I would burrow into a giant mound of warm, melty cheese, and now it's too late to do anything to remedy this situation. Shame on you, Ubisoft, and shame on me for liking you. And if anyone from the development team happens to see this, just know that I don't blame you for this. And also, blink twice if you need help. At the end of the day, why exactly did I like Breath of the Wild more than Fenyx Rising? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. Breath of the Wild had a lot of personality and small touches built around very simplistic gameplay, so that discovery and exploration felt organic. The way Link hurts his foot if you kick something without shoes on, or how you discover you can roast food over open fire to change its healing benefits, you always feel like there's something new to discover, even if it's just a few frames of an animation you've never seen before. It kept my interest and made the world feel so much bigger and more intricate than it really was. Fenyx Rising, on the other hand, is basically the opposite of that, opting instead to cram as much token gameplay and terrible dialogue into as small a space as possible, and it all fits together about as naturally as an angry bull fits into a mid-sized sedan. I'll be the first person to fight tooth and nail to convince people that video games are an art form just as worthy of praise as any other method of storytelling, but if Breath of the Wild was an epic fantasy novel by J.R.R. Tolkien, Fenyx Rising would be self-insert fan fiction written by someone who thinks the fish people from Shadow over Innsmouth are kinda sexy. Anyway, thanks for stopping by. Like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and, well, I'll see you next time.